Welcome everyone to this seminar this afternoon, and delighted that Calm has excelled itself in its seminar series as the Center for Applied Linguistics and Multilingualism at NUI Galway, which forms part of the Moore Institute, and they've had a tremendous seminar series now for 2 years. And our colleague Dorothy Neagin is going to be speaking today, and more about that in a moment. My name is Daniel Carey. I'm director of the Moore Institute, and I just wanted to welcome everybody today. We've had well over 60 people signing up for the session, and very much looking forward to the discussion today. I'm really going to hand over without further ado to Stasia Antonievich, our colleague and co-director of Calm. So Stasia, you kick things off.
Thanks, Don, and welcome to everybody. Today's presenter is Dorothy Neagin from Ankudavne Oskolata Gelga. She will be talking about the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. And Dorothy is the director of the teaching of Irish in Ankudavne Oskolata Gelga in NUI Galway, where the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages was first adopted for Irish language courses in 2005. Dorothy has particular interest in language acquisition, translation, academic writing and integrity, as well as bilingualism and biculturalism. She has also published widely on the history of Irish language and journalism. I'm looking forward, Dorothy, to listening to your presentation, but just before you start, I would just like to remind everybody to use Q&A section for posting your questions, and we will address them then after the presentation. So over to you, Dorothy.
Gurmila Mahagat Stasia, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to present today. Now, apologies in advance, because this is more, I suppose, a personal account of how we have changed our approach to teaching in the Ankudavne, where I have worked for the last 30 years, and how my own practice has changed in the classroom, rather than, I suppose, a deep interrogation of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. But I suppose these musings and anecdotes, they are all linked to the CEFR, because as Stasia said, we have been using it for the last over 15, 16 years. So for those of you maybe who don't know, I'm sure most of you do, but the Common European Framework of Reference for Language, it was developed by the Council of Europe in the 1990s and was published officially in 2001. And its principal aim was to establish transparency in language competency. And we'll come back to that notion of transparency in a while, but that was the idea behind it, transparency in language competency. So we could judge across European countries if somebody told us that I have a level B1 in French, what that meant. So that it was an attempt to try and investigate and interrogate what we really meant by language competencies, and that would be transparent across languages. Now, the CEFR, it's widely used throughout Europe and beyond, indeed. Other frames of references have been based in it, but it has been on occasion oversimplified, and people focus on the one-page 6-level grid, which many of you may have seen. It's there. I'll come to it in a minute. The grid that shows levels from A1, which would be beginner, up to C2, which would be a proficient user of the language. So that grid, it describes the framework levels, but it doesn't really interrogate how the framework can be used for language testing, language learning, language assessment, authentic language learning. So I suppose my talk today, I want to kind of move beyond the grid, focus on 3 particular aspects of the CEFR and its influence or its use over the last 20 years. And those are language testing and self-assessment, language and cultural competences, and lesser spoken or heritage languages, and the framework. And I suppose the reason I chose those 3 points is because they're most of interest to me. And they're the things that maybe I've grappled with over the last 20 years, and I've discussed with many other teachers over the last 20 years. So as I said, that's the grid. And when people ask, what's the common framework? This is what you're showing on the page. And there's so much more. I mean, when I wasn't so careful about the environment in the early 2000s, when I was trying to learn about it, I photocopied and printed and tried to read as much about the framework as possible. And it is incredibly dense, it's incredibly rich material, and we don't utilize it enough. So if we look for a minute at, sorry, I keep going the wrong way. If we look for a minute at the question of language testing and self-assessment. So the notion of the reflective learner, it's a central concept in much of the material related to the CEFR. And it's a common enough idea now, but it wasn't in the early 2000s. And the can-do statements, there's hundreds of can-do statements within the framework, within the literature about the framework. And what these are, they do what they say in the tin. I can read a short piece of correspondence or an email from a colleague based on, I can write a short letter of thank you, I can. So those are the type of things, that's what I mean. So those can-do statements and the notion of the reflective learner, they are central within the CEFR. And also the European language portfolio. And again, many of you will have heard of this, maybe you all have heard of it, but the ELP, it goes in tandem, it goes hand in hand with the Common European Framework of Reference. Within the portfolio itself, there are three elements: a language passport, and this provides an overview of your proficiency in different languages at a given point in time. Then there's the language biography. It helps you to plan, to reflect upon, assess your learning processes and your progress. And then a dossier, which offers you an opportunity to select materials that document and illustrate and show your achievements or experiences as you've on your language journey. So we introduced the portfolio to our, excuse me, I think I've skipped a page there, I have, yeah. To our courses in 2005. So we were early adopters of the CEFR and of the portfolio, okay? So the courses involved were the language courses, diploma courses at level A1 up to C1. Now, within these courses, and I suppose something that's always been interesting for me, and I've been teaching, I suppose now over 30 years, is that the range and variety of students. It was challenging from the beginning, and it always has been challenging. But this variety, which we kind of had from an early stage, because we were doing diploma courses that weren't as academic as the degree courses, we had learners from age 17 up to 70 and beyond. Now, the profile of college students has changed, and you know, that variety is kind of seeping through in lots of areas in third level education. But we had that from the beginning, and it was always something that interested me. How did you properly teach? How did you differentiate within class? But how did you properly assess all these students? So one of the things that we tried was the language portfolio, because we started using the CEFR. And I suppose our principal aim was to encourage reflective learning, because it was central in the European framework of languages. It was to enable students to direct their own learning and to encourage lifelong learning. Now, those three aims, they come from the CEFR and from the European language portfolio, but they chimed well with what we were trying to do with our diploma classes, because the kind of learners we had were so varied from different age groups and from different educational backgrounds. So we started to examine the portfolio in oral examinations from 2005, and this was with mixed results. And I'm talking about this because I'm using this example as an example of a misstep, you know, a mistake we made very early on when we were trying to implement the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. So forgive me for going back a bit in time for this. So we used it for about 4 years, and we really were trying to implement the ideas of the framework, but it was with mixed results with the portfolio. It worked to an extent with older students, and that ties in with David Little and Radka Perklova, what they have said about the older students, the older language students, and these would typically be people in their 50s, 60s, 70s. They were happy to use a portfolio, they were happy to reflect, but the younger students weren't. The people who were using language in their work, they were happy to reflect because it meant it was important to them that they could say with confidence that they would be able to do a particular thing if that was needed in their work. It worked with competent students, but not really with native speakers. So some students were more responsible for their learning because of the portfolio, but these were generally the better students anyway. So it caused us to think, well, what are we doing wrong, or why isn't this working? Why are the younger students resistant? Why are they ambivalent to the concept? They were collecting material for the portfolio on the day before the oral examinations, and there was a huge problem in assessing. How do we assess a portfolio that's put together the day before? So of course, I mean, you know, this was a mistake on our part. I went to the tutors at the time, and we had about 15 responses, and again, it's a small group of teachers, but they were in different groups around the country, and they were dealing with our students. The principal points that came from that was that they were ambivalent, and even more than that, they were negative about linking it to assessment. Okay. Now, they also felt that they needed more training in the use of portfolio. It seemed to suit the older, more mature students, as I said, rather than the traditional student. And we really felt that we needed to redefine or define properly, reimagine our marking schemes. And of course, I suppose, and this was, I suppose, an epiphany moment for me, we were approaching the notion of assessment in the incorrect way. We were trying to use a tool for self-assessment to examine our students. Now, in hindsight, it seems obvious. But at the time, in our, I suppose, our efforts to try and implement the CEFR, to try and bring in the portfolio, to try and encourage our students to try and be in line with this movement across Europe, there were a couple of mistakes made. So we learned from our mistakes, and it led us to do a more thorough interrogation of assessment and of our own assessment methods. Now, again, I'm going to share another anecdote from around this time. It was in 2011, early 2012. So when I was thinking about this, and when we were trying to develop, based on the Common European Framework, we were trying to develop authentic assessment and different ways of assessment, you know, within the diploma courses. So I circulated an essay that among 38 colleagues in this university and in 4 other institutions around the country. And I asked the participants to mark it from a language point of view. They weren't marking the material. It was a language exercise. So they were asked to mark this essay and to enter their mark on an online survey. So they could explain their reason for awarding a particular mark, although this was not required, and the marking was anonymous. So I got 16 replies out of 38 colleagues. And what was astonishing was that the marks varied from 55% to 80%. So across 3 grades, from 2 up to first class honour, with an average mark of 65%. Now, what I didn't tell the participants in advance was that I had written the essay as an undergraduate in 1989. Now, I'm really showing my age. It's obvious in the white hair anyway, but I'd written it in 1989, and the mark I received at the time was 46%. So notwithstanding the fact that I may have thought that I was unduly harshly marked at the time, I suppose it did indicate to me possibly a drop in standards, our grade inflation. Now, I knew it was just one essay sample, but it really showed that we weren't really grappling properly with this problem of how we are marking, how we are approaching marking. So just before I leave that point, some of the comments that came, one of them said that I'd asked the Stilvarsende, so I lacked having any personal style in my writing. And the other one, but that was one of the comments. But one of the other comments was, there was aqua and green, there was a sense of fun. So I'll take that. But I suppose it's just an example to show what we were trying to do. We were trying to see, can we get on the same page, how we, in the way that we mark things, in the way that we approach assessment. And again, we went to the Common European Framework, and this is what we were using all the time. And we made mistakes, and we didn't always do it correctly. And we didn't, I suppose, use the framework in the proper way. Okay, and that's maybe what I'll talk about. So we did take steps to try and rectify this, to try and come across to, to come across or to develop a proper assessment scheme at each level, and to try and develop further our assessment methods. So there was extra emphasis on marking schemes, how marks are allotted. There was emphasis on transparency, because again, that was central, as I said earlier, and that is central in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. But we were looking at transparency from the point of view of the students. So for example, we were trying to say, well, in the oral exam, there are maybe 10 marks for pronunciation. There are maybe 10 marks for presentation skills. There are 10 marks for communicative skills. So that was what we started with. What we found with that was grade inflation. We found that when we broke everything down, that where out of 5, you might give 4 out of 5, you wouldn't really think that that's 80%. And that's what happens when you break down marks. So this again was a problem. It was all a learning experience. Now, I hope my maths were right there. But I'm interested in what Royce Sadler has written about this. And he wrote a great article, Interdeterminacy in the Use of Preset Criteria for Assessment and Grading. This was in 2008. And he questioned this move towards a system in which the assessors attempt to, as he said, deny their subjective, his or her subjective judgment. Okay. And this was interesting to me, because what he was saying, experienced assessors are often aware that an outstanding essay may not be outstanding on each criterion. So if we stick to the criteria, another problem is that for the very good essays, we might undermark them, we might undervalue them. So we tried again within the Common European Framework to look, well, what's best practice here? So this made us move towards grade descriptors, rubrics. We still have a marking scheme, and that's something that really should be interrogated further. Do we need to give a percentage? Now, most universities do. It's not pass or fail. Most universities do, and that's where we're caught there. And I think that needs more discussion, whether we really need to look at, well, what does it mean? If I have a degree, that's a pass degree as opposed to an honours degree. And with languages, if I have a B1 level, but at 40%, as opposed to at 85% at B1. So again, this was a problem for us. This was something we would really need to grapple with. So we reassessed marking schemes. We looked at grade descriptors, rubrics, and the notion of conceptual marking. And I really like this idea, because it can go hand in hand with a marking scheme that's done out mathematically, but the conceptual marker, well, that'll be the experienced assessor who can see a first class honour, even if the marking scheme isn't really strictly giving this person a first class honour. Or if the marking scheme might be giving someone 55 where really, you know, it's not that good. So what we tried to do was come up with a scheme that brought in both, that we were transparent as the CEFR asked for, but when we gave a marking scheme, we gave more. We gave grade descriptors and we gave rubrics, okay? And the CEFR provides all this, okay? What we didn't do at the beginning was to properly look and to really interrogate all the material that was there. Because much of this discussion can be found in the framework of reference and the related documents that go with it. So on a first reading, some of the ideas seem simple, and they are, but it's how they're applied. And we found that we needed to revisit a lot of our initial ideas about how we would properly use the CEFR and use it in our teaching. Now, despite the emphasis on self-assessment that I've just mentioned, the grid that I showed at the beginning and the can-do statements, they do provide a good starting point for developing assessment tools. One of the challenges for us, or maybe it was just for me, was recalibrating expectations. So, for example, you know, my idea was if you were at C2, you had to be proficient in every aspect of language to be at C2, because that's the highest level. So you'd have to be able to talk about anything at level C2. It was a leap of faith for us, and maybe it's, again, it's just for me, that errors are acceptable when you're learning a language. And what is central is communication and the learner's needs. Again, maybe in hindsight, it seems obvious. It does seem obvious in hindsight, and maybe to you it seems very simple. But any of us who've been teaching languages for many years, these things weren't discussed 30 years ago, not in any great depth, not to any great level. Because our idea of correcting the script from a student was to mark every single mistake, to put a red line through it, to correct it, and maybe not even sometimes, maybe we didn't correct it, maybe we just put the red line through it. And everything was marked, everything was shown to be an error. The CEFR allows mistakes. And in fact, it explains that this is what happens when you're a learner. It's not to say that errors shouldn't be noted. And there's some great work done about, you know, looking at the errors that learners of Irish typically make, and how do we address that in our teaching. But the notion that it's okay to have errors, to me, was a slight revelation. In talking about the European language portfolio, again, Little and Perclova have said the problem can be solved. They're talking about this problem of like how to know everything. It can be solved by recognizing that each of the general descriptors in the language passport must be expanded in a way appropriate to the age, the needs, the interests of the learners in question. And this provides huge freedom as we reimagined our assessment methods. But it also means extra work, that you really need to ask yourself, what does your student need to learn? What do you want them to know? What's important in their learning journey, their language journey? Okay, I want to talk a little bit about VRIP and ALT. Now, the Association of Language Testers in Europe, again, many of you may have heard of it, and Maynooth is member, Maynooth University, and there are many associate members and individual affiliates. Now, on its own website, it tells us that its groundbreaking work to set common levels of language proficiency across different languages contributed significantly to the later development of the Council of Europe's Common European Framework of Reference. So ALT preceded the CEFR, but I suppose just to indicate that, you know, this work was going on prior to the publication of the CEFR. But in 2011, ALT published a very useful book, A Manual for Language Test Development and Examining. Now, they've had several other books since, but in this one, they talk about the 4 principles of assessment and that's that, is the assessment valid? Is there validity? Is it reliable? Is it robust? Influence and practical. Okay, will it influence how the students' learning and the outcome of the learning? And is it practical? I mean, we'd all love maybe to try some things in our exams that just aren't practical if you have a limited amount of time, a limited amount of resources. And one of the big things that they do was to emphasize the target audience, or the reader. And again, this idea of the communication element, which seems central to language learning, but when it's spelt out there in front of you in a manual, it's actually great because it does allow you more freedom to think about what really is valuable to this learner. So we did adopt a lot of the elements of the VRIP module in our approach to testing on the Diploma sa Gaeilge courses. But we also use some of the ideas while trying to develop an approach for Irish language assessment for appointment to jobs in our university. And again, you know, this wasn't a perfect system. It's not a perfect system now, but some jobs within our university do require Irish. And the way it was being managed or examined, you know, it wasn't perfect. We needed to look at it. And my colleague, Lisa Nilahartha, was working on this at the time, and I did a little bit of work with her. But we drew on Lenz and Schneider, and they said that descriptors of language proficiency and language competence not found in the common European framework of reference, that may indicate a certain level of competence for a learner belonging to a specific target group, learning and acting in a specific context. So again, one of these pieces that I read that saw, well, this is what we need to do. We don't just take the can-do statements within the European framework. What we do is we look at what we need and we create our own can-do statements and descriptors of language proficiency within a particular context, within a specific context. And I think 30 years ago, when I was a student, we did language exams. There weren't really in any context. It was a translation that could have been about anything, and maybe an essay. And that was typical from year one to degree. So with the examinations for job applicants, there was a little bit of scope there, to try out some of these ideas. So now these are in Irish, but these are the assessment criteria that we tried to develop at the time. And like things that I've highlighted there, sorry, I've gone forward, that what we were looking for, the criteria related to the job within that the person was in. Okay, it wasn't just generally whether this person is a proficient speaker or this person writes very well. It was within this context, within the context of the university, this person is able to do this, and this person should be able to do this. And we created them for Tishkent, that's understanding, for listening, for reading. And we mentioned specific things within the work environment that would be necessary, dependent again on the job. But for example, could this person listen to a Córá Gohan, to a phone conversation and understand it? Could they work at Crinaha meetings? Could they manage Gná Israchan ó Vic Lane, general inquiries from students? So each of our descriptors took on board the context. Now, in a way, when it's for a specific job, it's easier to do that. When you're dealing with large groups of students, it's more difficult. But yet it was a very good exercise for us to try and think about what we're really trying to achieve. And it also, again, gets us to think about what proficiency really means. And can you be proficient in one area of life, in the language, and not in another? And of course you can. I mean, I remember, because I'm not a native speaker, and I've used this before, but I remember when my children were young, because I hadn't been brought up with Irish, I remember asking a colleague, how do you say you're teething in Irish? Because when the babies were small. And I never knew that language. I never learned that language. It wasn't part of my proficiency in Irish. It wasn't a language I'd ever used. So that's just a simple example of what we were trying to look at. Can we better design our assessments to take those type of things into account? So we need an exam for young parents. But that type of thing. I mean, specific purpose, language for specific purposes, LSP, which we now is common use, that term, and that's what that means. Okay, it's specific purpose. So within the framework, within the grid, there's a lot more that can be done to allow us to develop those type of assessments and materials for teaching. Now, another area of the CEFR, again, which I didn't find in much of the literature before, it was this notion of language and cultural competences. That it wasn't just enough to know the language, that you really need to understand the culture of the target language. And I really like that quote there from Anthony Burgess, who actually wrote A Clockwork Orange. But he was a translator himself. And what he said, translation is not a matter of words only. It is a matter of making intelligible a whole culture. And it's the same, I think, with language learning. Unless we understand the culture, a lot of what we learn in a language will not be useful to us. An example of that this morning, a colleague of mine was trying to translate one line, welcome to Ukrainians. Ukrainians are welcome to Ukrainians. I think that was it. That was all that was in it, because a group of Ukrainian refugees are coming to stay in the area where he lives. And I asked a friend of mine who is Ukrainian, and she said, she gave me 4 different ways of possibly how you could say this. And she asked me, well, what is the context and who will be there and what exactly do you mean when you say welcome? Because there are many ways to say welcome. And I thought this was fascinating because it was 3 words, and we spent an hour discussing what exactly would be the best translation for this, to have it exactly correct for the Ukrainian people who are coming to stay in Ireland. So the CEFR does emphasize the cultural competences and plurilingualism. And there's a very good, one of their publications there, the Intercultural Experience and Awareness, European Language Portfolio Templates and Resources, Language Biography. This is particularly useful, I think, and has been particularly useful for us who speak lesser spoken languages, lesser used languages, minority languages, heritage languages. There's so many names for them now, and a lot of them are loaded, and a lot of them we don't like to use. But there's often the perception, or at least there was, that Irish really wasn't a modern language. It was old-fashioned. I think one of the big things the CEFR has done has been an equalizer, that each language is valuable and each language can be part of this framework. And each language, whether it's your first language or your second language, is worthwhile and useful. So the notion of plurilingualism, and again, it's a new enough concept. I remember, when we first talked about plurilingualism and trying to differentiate it from multilingualism, a lot of people grappled with this. But so I've taken a quotation. I haven't tried to explain it myself. So plurilingualism, it differs from multilingualism, which is the knowledge of a number of languages. Multilingualism may be attained by simply diversifying the languages on offer in a particular school or educational system. Now, beyond this, the plurilingual approach emphasizes the fact that as an individual's experience of language in its cultural context expands from the language of the home to that of society at large, and then to the languages of other peoples, whether learnt at school or college or by direct experience, he or she does not keep these languages and cultures in strictly separated mental compartments, but rather builds up a communicative competence to which all knowledge and experience of language contributes, and which languages interrelate and interact. Another moment of an epiphany for me, that multilingualism, prior to that, you had the idea that you had to be proficient to really say you're a multilingual. With plurilingualism, what we're saying is any knowledge of any language you have is valuable. And if it's your home language, or if it's your school language, or if it's your work language, it's all part of you and your plurilingualism. Okay. And it's a very nice concept. It's a very powerful concept. And it's very, very useful in the case of lesser used languages. And also in the case, in the case of Irish, and also in the case, for example, Stasha might be better placed to discuss this, but for maybe migrants who feel maybe sometimes that their home language isn't as important as the language that they learn at school. And what plurilingual says is it's as important. And you don't have to be equally proficient in all these languages. Knowing a bit of some is still part of our understanding of other cultures and other languages. So I won't read all that out, but at just this point, the CEFR points out that intercultural awareness includes an awareness of regional and social diversity in the world of origin and the world of the target community. Intercultural skills and know-how include the ability to bring the culture of origin and the foreign culture into relation with each other. Cultural sensitivity, the capacity to fulfill the role of cultural intermediary between one's culture and the foreign culture, and to deal effectively with intercultural misunderstanding and conflict situations, and the ability to overcome stereotyped relationships. This is what the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages claims, but I think it shows the value and the power that language can have. And if we value all the languages, and if we value the person who is a plurilingualist, that's the right thing to do. The lesser spoken or the heritage languages and the framework, the emergence and acceptance of plurilingualism as an important part of our understanding of languages and language learning has added value to lesser spoken languages, to home languages, to heritage languages. And I have absolutely no doubt about that. So to go back to the original question, the CEFR is 21 years old now. What have we gained from it? It provided a framework and a huge amount of resources for many of the developments in our thinking and practice regarding teaching and assessment, cultural awareness, plurilingualism, and not only for me personally, not only within this university, but across Europe. It's made us more aware of the importance of languages, and there's been more discussion about language teaching and valuing languages. It's caused us in this university and many colleagues I've spoken to in other universities to really interrogate our teaching methods and assessment methods. And one other of the good things that I've seen in the last 20 years is the notion of peer review, which doesn't necessarily come from the CEFR, although it is mentioned there. But I think we've seen an awful lot of linguists and language teachers working together on many European projects and the many language projects to try and grapple with some of these questions or grapple with some of these assessment methods that are being suggested by the Common European Framework. Differentiation in our teaching methods. I think I'm not sure when the concept was first mentioned in the literature, but certainly in the last 10, 15 years, we've heard so much about it. How do you differentiate between language levels, between your students in the classroom. We've discussed grade inflation. It has made us really examine in language teaching how grade inflation impacts us and what impacts grade inflation, I should say. Ideas of conceptual marking and authentic assessment, this has been central, that the assessment, and David Little talks about this all the time, must be authentic. One of the other areas that I'm interested in is academic literacy. And any discussion on academic literacy ought to include some reflection on the role of language in learning and the importance of language proficiency. This isn't as widely discussed in the context of the CEFR, but I'm putting it out there as something that maybe we should do a bit more, that we should maybe investigate that a bit more. One great thing for language teachers is that there is a growing regard for the area of applied linguistics and language learning, but we do lag behind in training. There are training courses at primary level and secondary level, not so much at third level. How do we engage learners in the third level system? How do we engage older learners? How do we properly manage different age groups and different language needs in our classroom? We noted at the beginning that the CEFR was developed to establish transparency in language competency. It has certainly provided a framework for discussion, and it, without a doubt, has helped to bring an increased precision into language teaching and testing. It's an evolving body of work. It's flexible, it's changing, and at its heart, this notion of transparency, but also the importance of languages and plurilingualism, their value and how we value them, and by extension, how we value the speakers of those languages. However, to finish, I won't use a quote from myself. I'll use one from Brian North from the Euro Centres Foundation in Zurich. And he has said, the CEFR is not a method, it's certainly not a panacea, but it is considerably more than just a set of 6 proficiency levels. It offers an opportunity to look at planning, teaching, and assessment from different perspectives and to see how they all link up. Joined up thinking is the key. So, Gurmila Mahagov, I want to thank again the directors of CAM, Stanislava, who's here, John Walsh, and former director Laura McLaughlin. I'm really indebted to Laura. I'm not sure if she's here today, but for many years I worked on some projects with Laura and I learned an awful lot from her, so it's nice to mention her. My colleagues in Aon and the Gael Defiami who've listened to me go on about some of these problems over many years, particularly I'm going to mention them: Odi, Fiona, Belinda, Lisa, Hugh, Maura, Trasa, Garjin, Dahi, Don, Crocker, Michal, Eamon, and all my other colleagues in Active and Hulscully of the Gaelga, those in the Gaelga and in the School of Languages, a wider set of colleagues throughout Ireland and abroad, and also the external examiners. And I've put them up there because they have been brilliant when we've really tried to grapple with these questions about how do we teach? How do we teach fairly? How do we assess fairly? So Professor Donald O'Boyle, Malachy O'Neill, Cian Marnell, Caoimhín O'Donnell and Gardine Elilash. And above all, thank you to the creator of the CEFR. And that's it. Gurmila Mahbub.
Gurmila Mahbub, Dorothy, thank you for this brilliant and really kind of enlightening talk. Because we need to finish by 5 o'clock, I'm not going to talk too much, but I'm going to go to the questions because we already have some questions. So we have Ivan Evans, who asks, to what extent, if at all, is the CEFR used as a framework for the teaching of Irish in the schools? And apart from in the university context, which you mentioned, to what extent are employers in Ireland aware of or use the CEFR levels when recruiting?
Okay, thank you, Ian. In schools, yeah, some work has been done by David Little. He did a lot of work in Irish schools, and there were some frameworks. So there's a portfolio for primary schools, but it's not necessarily in the curriculum. I've seen it and it's in use, but it's not part of the curriculum. So for example, I have worked on some primary school books where there's, I suppose they use some of the ideas within the framework, but it's not ostensibly part of the framework. But then, yeah, in some places there have been some pilot work using the European language portfolio. So they have been, I suppose, sorry, to make a long answer short, there have been language portfolios developed for the Irish primary level. I haven't seen anything at secondary level. As regards the second part of your question, in the public service or for jobs, well, the Language Commissioner at the moment is looking at increasing the amount of people with Irish who will be employed within the public service, and they will be using the language framework for recruitment. So it's not used widely, but certainly within the public service, this will be coming in the next, in the near future, in the next year, or maybe, yeah, the next year, I'd say next year, 18 months.
Okay. So the next question is from Ima. What did the 38 examiners think of the results, 55 to 80% of your test and your original 46% essay?
They all thought I was unfairly marked. No, yeah, they were shocked. They were shocked, and they actually were a little bit annoyed with me that I had done this, because, you know, it was blind. You know, it was blind marking, but it was blind marking purposely. Yeah, some of them came into my office and were saying, you know, I'm defending my mark, and I said, I don't know what mark you gave me, you know, and it didn't really matter. It was trying to. They were surprised, I suppose, and actually shocked. So it was actually a good exercise because it got us to think about how are we marking things? How are people who are given the same essay and who work and teach in a third level institution giving a mark that is so variable and that varies very much from what was given 20 years previous to that?
But, you know, we also see that in our marking, I mean, the system of marking, we have the rubrics, we are all taught how to do it. We, for example, final year projects, we double mark. And then when we compare marks, sometimes they're identical, but sometimes there are discrepancies. So, you know, we are all subjective, and we all sometimes maybe expect different things from what we read. So.
Absolutely, and that's why I'm a firm believer, even though they can be the longest and most boring meetings of the year, I'm a firm believer in exam boards where we take time,
yeah,
and where we really talk to the external examiners. That's why I mentioned them. They have been great. They took time going through, you know, lots of scripts with us so that we could, I suppose, develop a robust, sure that we were robust in our marking schemes.
Yeah. We have another question for anonymous attendee. So CEFR is being referenced in the new junior cycle specifications, which is positive.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, that's not something I had seen. I have worked on a couple of junior cert books, but I haven't seen that. So it's good to know. It's good to know. Yeah.
So Mary says Goramila Mahagot Dorothy, and then something else which I can't read in Irish.
Curriláthar on station, yeah. Thank you to Marie. Oh, well.
Yeah, these are all the questions that we currently have. I have to say I was really particularly interested in your notion of plurilingualism, or well, not your only your notion, but plurilingualism. And, you know, in the literature that I look at, I was thinking kind of maybe we should rename our masters to be masters in plurilingualism rather than multilingualism. But really the definition that we take of multilingualism is now a functional definition. And it refers exactly to what you said. We are not we are not equally proficient, or rarely people are equally proficient in two languages. And exactly the example that you were that you gave about your experience when you had children. I had exactly the same experience in Germany. My German was fluent and fine, but I didn't know a single word about babies.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And today, giving this talk, I would have been happier to give, not happier, but more comfortable giving it in Irish, because I talk about it in Irish all the time. So it is fascinating how our minds work. But you know, I mean, you know, we consider ourselves fluent still in I consider myself fluent in Irish and English, but not in every.
And this is very interesting also what you just said, because I mean, Irish is your second language and you would be more comfortable and confident to give this talk in Irish. I feel the same. Serbian is my native language, but when people invite me to give a talk there, I'm always relieved when they say, oh, our students, or we want to practice English, so could you do it in English? And I'm always really, partly because of course, I have all sorts of prepared presentations in English, which I can then modify for this particular purpose, but partly because I don't have the vocabulary. And I don't have the vocabulary, for example, for writing emails. Because I just don't write emails in Serbian. I left Serbia when that started, so I never did. There are a few other comments. So Eamon says it's used by the Teaching Council to recognize teachers for teaching languages. Yes, that's true. Yeah, that's right. And Eamon and I work on or teach on a course where we do have teachers. Yes, and you do have to have a B2.2 to teach in a secondary school. Yeah. No, that's correct. Yeah. Thanks, Eamon. And then we have Martin. Thanks for your great presentation. Where would one find CEFR information for Gaeilge? How much information is given to course creators, teachers, etc.? Well, Martin, most of it is online on the Council of Europe website, but I can share some stuff with you. So I can, if you want to email me directly, and I can send you on some resources. Yeah. Okay, another question from Eamon. Great talk, Dorothy. My question is about benchmarking between different languages. How can we be sure that a C2 in Irish is the same as other languages such as French? I think that's a brilliant question because of comparing grammars and comparing sociolinguistic situations and functional use, as you said before. Yeah, I suppose if we're fairly certain that the assessment methods, if the people assessing used the Common European Framework correctly, I suppose we can be fairly certain that they are. But it is an interesting question. I always put it down, and this isn't maybe a very satisfactory reply, but I often ask myself when I'm speaking to someone in Irish, you know, would I be inclined to switch to English? Is the conversation too difficult? Would I be inclined just to, you know, for the sake of it, just to speak in English? So this is always my level of C2. And in a way I'm joking, but another way, I think it's not a bad benchmark, because if you're at C2 proficiency or C1, there's no way that you're going to want to switch into the other language if the person you're speaking to, so that there's an equality there. So that's how I look at it, you know. So the question of communication then becomes central. Is the person who's speaking French speaking to a native speaker without any difficulties? Well, then you can be fairly sure that, you know, the communication is happening. The testing of languages at the lower levels is more problematic, because full proficiency means there's no issues. In fact, my problem is often with A2 and comparing A2 in different languages and what is expected. And there is as well an issue. I mean, Irish isn't too bad. We have a huge corpus of terminology,
But there are some lesser used languages where there's whole language domains that aren't covered.
Mm.
And that becomes difficult. So the problem is that we have to look within the context, because there will be language domains like astrophysics where some languages won't have any vocabulary developed in that language. Or if they do, it's a very artificial vocabulary that's been developed and it's not really used. We have a huge terminology database, which is absolutely fantastic on terma.ie. But I mean, very many of us will use very little of that terminology ever. So there is an issue, Eamon. There is a problem. And I suppose the only way we can cure it, as I say, at C2 level, I'm not worried, because I think proficiency, we recognize proficiency. Proficient speakers recognize each other. But at the lower levels, where I think we need to be important to always specify in the domain, in which domain or in which context. And that becomes important. It makes it difficult when you have to write down what level you think this person is, you know, and it makes it difficult when all you get in your transcript is a message. But maybe we should be moving more towards describing what this person can do. You know, I think that's a much more valuable way of assessing and saying in particular context, because, you know, French and English are you know, huge vocabularies, but Irish, great vocabulary because of terminology, and they've done great work there. But whether those terms are in use, they're not, you know, they're not widely in use, you know.
But you're touching now on the issue of French Institute creating terminology for French instead, so, and kind of encouraging people to use those terms instead of borrowings from English. But everybody keeps their borrowings from English. In Serbian, we have loads of borrowings from English and so on. No one will, I don't know if I say, I don't know, the seminar is going live. I would say live in Serbian as well, rather than, you know, use the Serbian word which exists, computer. We have a Serbian word for computer, but everybody calls it computer. So there are loads of these borrowings, and English is really strong. I always say that to my students, that English is global language and is kind of really invasive. And Irish is unfortunate in the sense that it's in the context of that. So it's not only difference that you have, let's say, between Turkish and German, if you're a Turkish speaker in Germany, but over the top, you have the global dominance of English, which further suppresses, you know, like I don't speak hardly any German in Ireland, because there is always someone who doesn't speak German around in the group, but everybody speaks English. And that's the same thing with Irish. There is always would be someone, and I feel bad when I'm in group of Irish speakers that I can talk about Irish grammar, but I can't have a conversation.
Yeah.
And
no,
I
it's a
feel
difficult
bad,
one.
yeah, to push people to speak English, really.
Totally. And there's another element to that as well. You'll find people who have learned the language to a very high level and maybe bring up their children to Irish, that unless you're careful, your children will have an artificial type of Irish that isn't the same as the Irish of the Gaeltacht. I mean, with, you know, I mean, will I use Krishna, which is fridge, or fridge, which native speakers will be more likely to use when I was bringing up my children. So these crises of conscience, how, you know, who and which is correct. I mean, that's a paper for another day. I would always say go to what the native speaker says. I mean, that's my feeling on it. But yet, as a person who loves grammar, I cringe sometimes when it's not quite grammatically correct. So there's that as well. You know, how does a non-native speaker become a native speaker? How to become accepted within? And that's why the notion of cultural competencies is very useful. But it's difficult in Ireland because Irish and English speakers have similar cultures. We have similar cultures. You know, it's not as distinct as culture in other countries. Yeah.
I have two more questions, and we really need to kind of speed through the answers. So are the grades you award San Akadov at the end of a course aligned with the CEFR, or do you use it more as tool for planning course materials?
We use it for planning course materials, but you will get on your transcript, it'll say, you know, Diploma sa Gaeilge at level A2, and then you can build up and get B1 and B2. So yeah, no, they're aligned with the framework, and it's in the actual qualification. It's mentioned in the qualification.
And the last one, Eamon says, sorry, one last question. Dorothy, any idea where B2.2 comes from? I mean, this breakdown between B2.1 and
B2. Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's. Do you know what, Eamon? We'll go for coffee and talk about that one. So we will, because I know that we have to finish up here, and I'm not cutting you short. I will talk to you about it, but I'll buy you a coffee for that one.
Actually, Dorothy, I wish we and I'm waiting for the moment when we are going to really go live on campus face to face, so that we can all go for let's say to a pub or something and continue our conversations, because I think there is lots more to say about these topics, and we would look forward to invite you back to continue this lovely discussion. Thank you for this time. I just want to say that recordings will be available on the Moore Institute YouTube channel, on Facebook, and we hopefully will soon be sharing them all on the CALM website. So this is the last seminar for this academic year, and we are looking forward to seeing you again in September. Thank you all again.